why might we, bring in some cardio? Well, of course, it makes life easier. If you were fitter, the tasks that you are doing are going to be less fatiguing, as Gary said, right? You go to walk down to the shops, you're huffing and puffing and you're out of breath, like that's not going to be an enjoyable experience. So if you're fitter, daily life is easier, right? But also in the context of resistance training, because again, we're talking about how do we integrate the two of these, it actually allows you to do more volume. You're actually fitter to do the work in the gym. Because think about it, if you are doing something that, say, you're doing a heavy set of 8, on squats or something, you're going to be a little bit fatigued after that. And not just fatigued in the muscles used, fatigued in the cardiorespiratory system, right? So if you have a better cardiorespiratory system, you're probably going to be able to recover between sets a little bit quicker, right? So it makes your gym work a little bit more efficient. Perhaps you can get more volume as a result, and potentially you can get more hypertrophy as a result of that, right? Now, it also helps with health, as we've discussed many, many times. You can have a lower heart rate, lower resting heart rate is probably one of the biggest indicators of health that I can think of, at least that is at least trainable, as at least like something that we can influence very readily. Like obviously there's other things that are big indicators of health, but this is something that is actually trainable. It's actually very easy to, I shouldn't say easy, it's actually very easy to manipulate, I suppose. So it is something that we should be looking at. If you have a lower resting heart rate, something below 60 beats per M, that means that your heart is doing less work at quote unquote rest, and again, it's making your life easier, but also that means that your heart has a potential for a longer lifespan. Obviously organs and stuff, they do have the capacity to, quote unquote heal or, fix themselves. So it's not the exact same analogy, but again, imagine you're putting fucking 200 kilometers onto your car every single day, which say, you've got 200,000 fucking heartbeats in a week. I don't know how many fucking it is. I don't know the maths, if you're doing less heartbeats for a same given task as someone else, then you're putting less wear and tear on the system, right? Again, that's not the perfect analogy for a human system because again, we do adapt, but it does have some merit, right? So that is something that we want to be aware of. You're actually making yourself healthier by doing some cardiovascular conditioning. And again, if the goal is to build more muscle, build more strength, have better body composition, etc., like we want to be able to do this stuff for a long time. It's not just a case of, I want to be able to do this stuff for the next 2 years, get as jacked as possible, and then die of a heart attack. That's obviously not the goal for most people, at least, right? So cardio is going to be really beneficial for that. Now, the issue that we run into is how do we actually integrate the two of these things? How do we actually integrate cardiovascular conditioning and resistance training, right? Because they actually do activate two, we'll call them dichotomous systems, right? Like resistance training, it basically leads to a situation where you have more activation of, we'll call it this protein, mTOR, right? And it used to be called mammalian target of rhabdomyosin, but now it's called mechanistic target of rhabdomyosin, right? So we have this mTOR, and that mTOR is responsible to an extent for signaling the cascade, or it's part of the signaling cascade, I should say, that leads to muscle building, right? So we want to have that if we're trying to build some muscle. It also, we'll call it an anabolic signaling pathway here, right? You can kind of think of it like that, right? So resistance training and protein intake, especially leucine, and does lead to increases in this signaling cascade, increases in this muscle building. Fantastic, right? The opposite system to this is the kind of, we'll call it the AMPK system, right? There's other names for it. You can think of it in terms of different things, but let's just call it the AMPK system, right? And that system is kind of antagonistic. It shuts off this mTOR system, right? Cardiovascular conditioning leads to more activation of this AMPK system, right? And that's good from the perspective that once we activate that AMPK system, we do actually get increases in like mitochondrial biogenesis. We get increases in angiogenesis, so more blood cell, or what's the fucking word? Veins, whatever, blood vessels is the word I'm looking for. We actually get more blood vessels going to different muscles, going to, the areas that we need it, so that you can get more oxygen into the working muscles. Because again, think about it, we need this cardiorespiratory system. Your blood is what transports all this stuff around your body, right? So when we're doing cardio, we're actually getting more activation of this AMPK system, right? Which unfortunately shuts off this muscle building system, right? So from a mechanistic standpoint, you could understand and go, Jesus Christ, if I do cardio, that means that I'm limiting my muscle building, right? Because it shuts off this other system, right? The unfortunate thing about that, as a very simplistic understanding, is that resistance training does actually activate the AMPK system once you're doing it, right? The mTOR system, or the muscle building system, doesn't actually kick in until 30 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours after your workout, right? So during your workout, you are technically, we'll call it catabolic. You are breaking down, right? The exact same way you are breaking down when you do cardiovascular conditioning, right? However, after resistance training, we then get the signal to rebuild. We get the signal to build from this mTOR, right? So that is something to be aware of, that you're not like cardio or resistance training does actually activate AMPK as well, right? It's not just like, oh, as soon as I do like cardio, I get AMPK, and as soon as I do resistance training, I get mTOR. That's not as simplistic as it initially seems. There is a lot more going on with this, right? But it does bear keeping in mind that there is some sort of interference if we're trying to hammer both of these systems at the same time, right? And this is one of those reasons that you don't see, huge jacked marathon runners, because the amount of volume that they have to do for a marathon running, it leads to a situation where they're not actually able to build muscle as effectively, right? However, you have to also factor in that marathon running, it behooves you to be lighter. Building more muscle above and beyond what you actually need, it doesn't help you with your sport, right? So we have to factor that in as well, right? But also we have to factor in the fact that you also see a lot of people that do a lot of cardiovascular conditioning and are jacked out of their mind, right? Look at CrossFit athletes, right? Jacked. Now, huge amount of anabolic steroid use, but they're jacked, right? You can see strongman competitors, again, jacked. They do a lot of cardio as well because they have to be fit for their competition, right? Rugby players, football players, like the different, like I meant American football players, I should say there. Now you see a lot of people that do conditioning work, resistance training work, and they're jacked and they're fit. So it's not like there's this dichotomous like either or. As soon as you do any conditioning, you're trying to build muscle, boom, it's gone. It's off the tables, right? It's off the cards, it's not happening. That's not how it works. You can do both, right? The thing is, how do we actually integrate like a program? Like how do we integrate the two of them together into an effective program, right? So do you have anything else to add on to that, Gary, before we actually get into kind of more of the integration stuff?
Yeah, so I suppose like one thing that I would add on there is that a lot of people, when they're focused on the resistance training side of things, just building muscle, building strength, they can be quite concerned initially when they're adding in that cardio, because even if they don't think, all right, it's not going to interfere, let's say in terms of like the cellular pathways, what they might feel is, well, it's going to take away from my recovery from weight training, etc. And I had an anecdote from a client this week who reached out to me and said, he's feeling like he is able to recover so much better in his sessions and between his sessions, and in particular within the session, that he's not getting as short of breath during his resistance training sets. And this is something we see quite frequently with people who, especially those who have a long weight training background or history, but don't have a solid base of cardiorespiratory fitness. That can be a deficit for them, because they're not able to handle as much training, because it's actually the ability to produce that energy during exercise that is the limiting factor, especially for sets of 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 plus. You're going to be limited there, not necessarily by your muscular strength, but by your ability to provide that energy in time. And if you've got better cardiorespiratory fitness, that can actually support your weight training performance and potentially increase the gains that you get in return. Now, there's not much evidence on that, because obviously this is very individual specific. Like, I wouldn't expect, for me, I've got a good level of fitness, so I don't expect that adding in more cardio is ever going to improve my weight training. It would be way better for me to do more weight training. But for someone who has a bodybuilding background, they get short of breath quite quickly, and it takes them ages to recover between sets. That individual, they could certainly benefit from, being
Probably a
more
better
fit.
example would be a power lifter,
Yeah,
when they're literally struggling to get over 5 reps.
100%.
Like a classic case where you're like, okay, you could actually definitely benefit from more cardiovascular conditioning would be a powerlifter who needs to move up a weight class, right? They need to move up a weight class and they struggle to do over 5 reps, right? So they're not able to build sufficient amounts of volume because, first of all, they're really conditioned towards only doing 5 reps. But if they try to do more, it's their lungs that are on fire. It's not really the muscles, right? So in that case, doing more cardiovascular conditioning is actually going to put them in a position where they can actually do more resistance training, recover from that resistance training, and then as a result of that, get into the next weight class up, which is kind of something that you wouldn't necessarily think of, because a lot of people think of cardio purely from the perspective of burning calories. That's it, right? And we will touch on that in a second in terms of using cardio to effectively burn some calories, right? But yeah, like I've had loads of clients in that same kind of position where you're like, oh, I actually started bringing in some more cardio, and all of a sudden I'm actually able to get better results. I'm able to recover from training better. My sleep is improved, et cetera, et cetera. And as we said, like if you've got a lower resting heart rate throughout the day, like life is just easier, So obviously recovery is going to be better for someone whose life is just easier. It's a less stressful endeavor to just walk across the room. Like if you walk across the room and you look at your heart rate tracking watch and it's like 120 beats per minute, like you are probably unfit. Like I walk across the room and my heart rate is 45, So you have to put that in context in terms of, okay, well, if mine is 45 and yours is literally 120 doing the exact same activity, who do you think is going to be more fatigued from that activity? Of course, it's the person that basically got into fucking proper cardiovascular or aerobic conditioning territory just walking across the room, So that's something to take into account, right? But I mean, as I said, we recovered all this stuff in the more in-depth podcast series already. So let's move on. Let's actually integrate this stuff.